Hey, welcome back. This is the Ben Shapiro Show on the big 8:10 a.m. On the line with us now is Congresswoman Michele Bachmann. Michele Bachmann was elected in 2006 to be the first Republican woman elected to the House from Minnesota. Her strong advocacy for her constituents earned her a second term in Congress in November 2008. She currently sits on the Financial Services Committee. Aside from being a stellar Congresswoman, and she really is top-notch, she and her husband have 5 children, and they've opened their home to 23 foster children. So she's a busy lady, and we thank Michele Bachmann. Thanks so much for coming on the program and spending some time with us.
Ben, I am a longtime fan of yours. It's an awesome opportunity to be with you today. It's just a privilege. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Well, let's start right off the top. Let me just ask you, you've been very hard on President Obama down in the Gulf Coast area. You've said that he should man up, essentially, when it comes to British petroleum. Last week he said that he went down to the Gulf Coast to find out who's, quote-unquote, ass to kick. Is that appropriate language for a president, number one? And number two, why is his language so much tougher on BP than it is on Muslim terrorists?
That's a good question. No, it is not appropriate language. Can you imagine Ronald Reagan saying that or President Bush saying that? No, absolutely not. I think the more appropriate thing is, what is he doing to solve the problems that are confronting our country today? When it came to BP, it actually took him 12 days to get engaged on dealing with that issue. That's a very long period of time. When it came to actually dealing with the BP issue, the president said that he wakes up every morning and goes to bed every night thinking about that issue. Well, were those talking points, or is that really true? We found out yesterday that the president had waited over 50 days and still had not spoken with the CEO of BP. How in the world are you a uniter in trying to come to conclusions and figure out what the best thing is to do to solve this problem if you don't talk to the guy in charge of the company who's dealing with the cleanup? Now remember, think of the hypocrisy that's involved here. The president continues to point it's an infantile response for the president to point blame at BP when the president has given over full authority to BP to deal with and manage the cleanup. Well, if the president wanted to, he could intervene, and he clearly hasn't.
Well, I mean, isn't that a running theme with this presidency? They're all about blame and not about actually doing anything.
Taking responsibility. He's not about taking responsibility, and that's why I say it is an infantile response to not take responsibility when you're the President of the United States, and that is all we have seen, unfortunately, coming out of this president is an unwillingness to take responsibility and continue to point at former President Bush, and that's what they're actively trying to do on their political side right now, somehow make this BP disaster George Bush's disaster. Well, I'm sorry it doesn't work that way. The Minerals and Management Service, which is in charge of the oversight of the deepwater oil rigs, there's a problem there with the Minerals and Management Service. The only part of MMS that is unionized are the inspectors that go out on the platform. And a lot of people don't know yet that the 2 inspectors that went out to BP to do the final inspection were a father and son team, both a part of the union. Why do they have 2 inspectors? One is supposed to look over the other one's shoulders to make sure that they have true accountability. Well, it raises a question of how independent is this accountability when they're A, unionized, and B, it's a father-son team.
Well, this administration has been soft on the unions to the point where it's not even soft on the unions. I mean, everything they've done has been essentially a giant giveaway to the unions over and over and over. I mean, in my opinion, the health care bill was all about a giant giveaway to the unions because unionization rates are so much higher in the public sector than they are in the private sector. And so if you suddenly nationalize 1/6 of the U.S. economy, that certainly gives fertile breeding ground for more unions. But I want to ask you, speaking of his violent language, and I mean, he's been just brutal on BP, talking about putting his boot on the throat of BP, talking about how he wants to go down there and kick someone's ass. I mean, frankly, I think, Michele, you could probably take President Obama, but that's off the record. Speaking of violent language...
Hey, I took karate when I was 17 years old. I am dangerous.
I know, no, I actually believe that. That was actually not said facetiously. I think you could probably beat up President Obama. But speaking of violent language, President Obama said back in 2008 about his political enemies, who are never terrorists, by the way. They're always people like members of the Tea Party. He said, to his supporters, I want you to argue with them and get in their faces. If they tell you, well, he's going to raise your taxes, you say, no, he's not. He's going to lower them. Well, he's already put into effect a quasi-tax with the health care bill. Now he's going to let the Bush...
In other words, go lie to people. That's what he's saying. Go lie to people.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Is it fair to call him a liar at this point?
Well, it's not a truthful statement. And that's really, I think, that is the elixir, Ben, of the Tea Party movement. People are telling the truth. And it's like the old child's fable of the emperor has no clothes. No one wanted to admit that the fuddy-duddy emperor wasn't wearing anything except an innocent child who told the truth. That's what Tea Party people are doing today. They're telling the truth about the madness of the government takeover of private industry, the madness of the deficit spending, so much so that last week we were 89% debt to GDP ratio. That was at the beginning of last week. By the end of last week, when I was preparing my speech on Israel, we were 90% GDP to debt ratio. And I thought, I must have misread this. Today we are 93%. Our debt is growing now exponentially. It's like $600 billion a month. That's greater than what our entire federal budget was not too long ago. So we're in a very precarious situation, and the folks who align themselves with the Tea Party are simply trying to tell the truth about the madness of the policies of the Obama administration, and that doesn't even bring into account the Israel-Gaza situation.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Congresswoman Michele Bachmann, phenomenal Congresswoman from the state of Minnesota. Michele, is President Obama better or worse than Jimmy Carter?
Worse. Easily worse.
I agree. I mean, so far, you would have to say that he's the worst president in United States history, with the possible exception. The only one who may not be is James Buchanan. Maybe James Buchanan.
Well, and the thing is, I think, here we are. People can't wait until November. They can't. They're practically lining up the polls now. They can't wait to go and vote. The only thing is, people wish that Barack Obama was up for re-election right now, because they would honestly love to have a chance to throw him out of office. Everywhere I go, people ask me, Michele, can we impeach the president? They want a referendum on him. And I also had someone today say, there's no way he'll run for a second term. No way. No one would vote for him. I don't know if the White House understands how the floor has dropped out under support for this president.
Let me shift gears for a second. There are a couple pieces of news that came out this week that I want to ask you about. One, both relating to the Middle East. One is that President Obama has now said that we are going to give $400 million to the Gaza Strip and to the West Bank. And the idea is we're going to give it to all of these terrorist entities, presumably for financial aid, essentially, because of really indirectly because of the Gaza flotilla. Has President Obama sided with the Islamic world against Israel at this point?
Well, it appears that way. This was horrific. Here you have an intentional provocation on the part of a Turkish-backed flotilla trying to break the blockade that has been set up by Egypt and by Israel for potentially to come against weapons going into the Gaza region. Why? Because thousands and thousands of rockets have been flown in against innocent civilians in Israel. What else is Israel supposed to do? Allow themselves to be killed? And so I think for the president to come out and give $400 million to a failed terrorist regime in Gaza run by Hamas. I mean, let's just understand what this is. The president last week had a choice. He could choose to side with the madman Ahmadinejad from Iran and Hamas, a terrorist organization, or he could put his lot in with Benjamin Netanyahu. This isn't even difficult to figure out which side you need to be on. This is easy. This is an easy one. And so here in an easy choice like that, he chose Hamas and he chose Ahmadinejad. And he chose to reward the Hamas organization with $400 million. Well, what's that going to do? That's only going to encourage them. More bad behavior means more money from the chumps in the United States. This is madness. And to do this to Israel, to undercut Israel, when Israel is sitting there like a sitting duck, and essentially say to Benjamin Netanyahu, and the way he humiliated him when he was here in March, to essentially say to him, if you have any plans to come against Iran, we won't have your back. Mm-hmm. What does that say about the Middle East? There's only one region where Jews are welcome. It's called Israel. And my firm belief is it isn't Israel that Hamas is so upset about or that Ahmadinejad is so upset about. It's the Jews. That's what they don't like. They don't like the Jews in Israel. And this is absolute bigoted racism.